The machines were the only sound in the room. A steady beep, a hiss of oxygen, the low electric hum of a hospital at 11 at night. Natalie Parker lay against the raised pillow, with a cast running from her wrist to her elbow, and a bandage taped along her hairline. And she was staring at the door the way she'd stared at boardroom doors her whole career. Waiting for someone to walk through it who mattered. No one had. Then the door opened anyway. And it wasn't a board member, and it wasn't her chief of staff, and it wasn't the man she'd been engaged to for 4 months before he quietly stopped returning her calls. The same week, the story about her accident hit the local news. It was Jack Sullivan, the warehouse manager she had fired 8 days earlier, standing in the doorway in a jacket still spotted with rain, holding a plastic container with a dish towel wrapped around it to keep it warm, and beside him, gripping 2 fingers of his free hand, was a 9-year-old girl in a yellow raincoat, holding a folded piece of construction paper, like it was something fragile. Natalie's mouth opened, before her mind caught up to it. "What are you doing here?" It wasn't a question so much as a door slamming, the last defensive reflex of a woman who had spent a week finding out exactly who did and didn't show up for her. Jack didn't flinch. He set the container down on the rolling table at the foot of the bed, gently, the way you'd set down something you were embarrassed to be holding. "Emma made you a card," he said. "She wanted to bring soup, too. So we brought soup." The girl stepped forward and held out the card without a word, and on the front of it, in marker, was a badly drawn son wearing sunglasses, and underneath it, in careful 9-year-old handwriting, "Get well soon, Miss Natalie. My dad says you're tough." Natalie looked at the card, then at soup, steam still rising faintly when Jack peeled back the towel. Then at Jack, who wasn't looking at her with anything like triumph or vindication or even much expression at all. Just a kind of quiet patience, like a man waiting to see if he was still welcome in a room he had every reason to never walk into again. To find out how a man wrongfully fired ended up the only person who showed up for the woman who fired him, stay until the very end. If stories like this one, the ones about people who get overlooked and underestimated, right up until the moment it matters most, means something to you, we'd love to hear it in the comments. So many of you watching have lived a version of this yourselves. There's an old argument that never quite settles, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Whether real loyalty belongs to the company you work for, or only to the people inside it who actually deserve it. Jack Sullivan was about to answer that question with his actions instead of his words, which was the only way he ever answered anything. 3 years ago, none of this existed. Not the accident, not the firing, not the card with the crooked sun on it. 3 years ago, Jack Sullivan was simply the best warehouse operations manager Meridian Freight Logistics had ever had, and almost nobody at the executive level knew his first name. He'd come to Meridian 9 years earlier as a floor associate, the kind of hire nobody remembers making, and within 4 years he'd been promoted to manager of the company's largest distribution hub, a 300,000 square foot facility outside the city that moved 11,000 pallets a week. He ran it the way he ran everything, quietly, early, and without complaint. He arrived before 6 and left after the trucks did. He knew the names of all 62 people on his floor, and their kids' names, and which ones were working a second job to cover rent. He had turned around the worst-performing hub in the regional network into the best one in 18 months, and he had done it without ever once putting his own name on the credit. That mattered to Jack, the not taking credit part, more than anyone realized. 4 years earlier, his wife Diane had died of an aggressive cancer 11 weeks after diagnosis, leaving him with a 5-year-old daughter, a mortgage, and a company health plan he could not afford to lose. He had learned, in the year that followed, exactly how thin the line was between a stable life and a collapsed one, and he had built his entire professional posture around never letting anyone at Meridian have a reason to notice him too much. Steady, reliable, invisible. A man who kept his head down because his daughter's whole world depended on his paycheck landing in the same account on the same day every 2 weeks, and he was not going to be the reason it didn't. Natalie Parker had taken over as CEO of Meridian 18 months earlier, the youngest person and the first woman to run the company in its 41-year history, brought in by a board that wanted growth after a decade of flat performance. She was 39, sharp enough to make experienced executives nervous in meetings, and under more pressure than anyone outside her direct reports understood. Meridian was 6 weeks from finalizing a $320 million logistics contract with a national retail chain, a deal that would double the company's revenue and, not incidentally, secure Natalie's position against a board that had been quietly discussing alternative leadership in a text thread she wasn't supposed to know existed. She had built walls a long time ago. Natalie had, brick by brick, starting with a father who told her ambition was unbecoming in a girl, and continuing through a decade of being the only woman in rooms where men assumed her chair belonged to someone's assistant. She had learned that warmth got mistaken for weakness, and so she had traded most of it away for precision, and the deal in front of her now was the kind of thing precision was supposed to protect, which was exactly why when the leak happened she moved so fast. 3 weeks before the contract's final signature window, confidential pricing structures from the retail deal turned up in the hands of Meridian's chief regional competitor. It wasn't a rumor. It was in a competing bid, word for word, numbers that had existed on exactly 4 laptops in the company. The board wanted a name within 72 hours. Natalie wanted one faster than that. And the man who brought her a name, calm, regretful, almost gentle about it, was David Whitfield, Senior Vice President of Operations, 44 years old, Ivy League MBA. The kind of executive who could make a threat sound like concern. David had built his career at Meridian on being the person who delivered bad news smoothly, and he delivered this news to Natalie in her office with the door closed, laying a printed access log on her desk like he hated having to do it. The log showed a login from Jack Sullivan's warehouse terminal at 11:47 p.m., accessing a shared drive folder containing the pricing structure documents 3 days before the leak surfaced. David hadn't said Jack did it. That was the skill of it. David never said things outright. He'd said, almost sadly, that he didn't want to believe it either, that Jack had always seemed like a good man, but that the access logs didn't lie, and that in a deal this size, Natalie couldn't afford to be sentimental about who she trusted. Natalie had looked at that log for 4 seconds. 4 seconds against 9 years of a man's work, and then she had picked up the phone and told her assistant to get Jack Sullivan into her office within the hour. The girl in the yellow raincoat, 3 years from that moment, had not been born into any of this yet as a fact Natalie knew. But the sun on the crooked construction paper card was already, in some sense, on its way, because everything that was about to go wrong for Jack Sullivan was about to happen for a reason that had nothing to do with betrayal, and everything to do with the same instinct that had made him invisible in the first place. Protecting somebody smaller than himself. He had no idea, walking into Natalie Parker's office that afternoon, that he was about to lose the only job he had, in defense of a secret he had chosen to keep entirely on his own. Natalie's office was glass on 2 sides, high enough up that the warehouse floor, Jack managed, was a gray rectangle in the distance. When he looked out the window while he waited for her to finish reading, she didn't offer him a seat. That detail would come back to her later, in the hospital, more than almost anything else. The fact that she had made a man who'd worked there 9 years stand. "I'm going to ask you once," she said, "and I want the truth, because I don't have time for anything else. Did you access the retail pricing files on the shared drive on the 14th? Jack didn't move much when he was thinking. It was one of the things people who'd worked under him had learned to read. The stillness meant he was choosing his words, not that he had none. "Yes," he said, "I did." Something in Natalie's chest tightened, the particular tightness of being right about something you didn't want to be right about. Why? And here was the moment that would define the next year of both their lives, though neither of them knew it yet. Jack could have told her the truth. The truth was that Priya Reyes, a 26-year-old logistics coordinator on his floor, 11 weeks postpartum with a son who'd been born 6 weeks early, and was still, at that point, making trips back to the NICU, had come to him in a panic 2 nights earlier. She'd been asked by David Whitfield's assistant. She'd assumed the request came from David himself, and maybe it had, though nobody would ever prove that, to pull a document from the shared drive using her login, late at night, from home, because Priya sometimes worked remotely on data entry to be near her son. She hadn't known what the folder contained. She'd pulled it, sent it where she was told to send it, and 2 days later realized, with the sick lurch of someone who understands too late, that she'd been used. She'd come to Jack sobbing in the break room before her shift, certain she was about to be fired, with a newborn in the NICU and a maternity leave she couldn't afford to lose the tail end of. And Jack, who knew exactly what losing a paycheck at the wrong moment could do to a family with a small child in it, because he had lived that exact catastrophe himself, had done the only thing he could think to do fast enough to matter. He'd logged into the shared drive himself, late that same night, from his own terminal, layering his own access on top of hers in the system logs, muddying the trail just enough, he hoped, that if anyone came looking, it would look like a mistake made by a manager checking on a report, not a coordinator sending confidential pricing data outside the building on someone else's instruction. He hadn't leaked anything. He'd simply made himself the visible name in a system he understood better than almost anyone in that building, to buy Priya cover. He didn't tell Natalie any of it, not one word. "I was checking the folder structure," he said instead. "That's all I'm going to say about it." Natalie stared at him. In another version of this story, she asks a second question. She asks why a warehouse manager would need to check the folder structure of a confidential executive drive at midnight. And something in that question might have cracked the whole thing open right there, might have made her curious instead of certain. But she was 6 weeks from a $320 million deadline, and a board that was watching her for the first sign of instability, and a senior VP she'd trusted for a year and a half sitting 2 floors down waiting for a decision, and certainty was so much easier to hold than curiosity. "That's not an answer," she said. "It's the one I've got. Then I don't have a choice." Her voice had gone flat, the register she used to end negotiations. "Effective today, you're terminated. Security will walk you out. I'm sorry it has to be this way, Jack, I mean that. But I can't have someone in a position of trust who won't explain himself, not with what's riding on this quarter." Jack nodded once. He didn't argue. He didn't ask her to reconsider, didn't point out 9 years of overtime nobody made him work, didn't mention that he'd once driven back to the warehouse at 2 a.m. during an ice storm because a refrigerated truck's compressor had failed, and 11 pallets of pharmaceutical shipments were on the line. He simply said, "Understood," and turned and walked out of the glass office past people on the floor below, who would spend the rest of the week whispering about what he must have done, because nobody except Natalie and David knew the actual accusation, and rumor fills a vacuum faster than truth ever can. 2 floors down in the break room, Priya Reyes watched him go and said nothing, because she was terrified, and because Jack, in the 30 seconds he had alone with her near the elevator bank before security arrived, had told her, quietly, not to say a word. "You've got a baby in the NICU," he'd said. "You can't afford this fight right now. I can." It wasn't bravado. It was arithmetic. He had savings. She didn't. He was one income supporting 2 people who were at least both healthy. She was one income supporting a family in crisis. He had made the calculation the way he made every calculation, fast and quiet and entirely in someone else's favor. He drove home that afternoon and sat in the car outside his house for 11 minutes before he went in, because Emma was going to ask how work was, the way she always did, and he needed a version of the truth that wouldn't scare her. When he finally walked in, she was doing homework at the kitchen table, and she looked up and said, "You're home early," and Jack said, "Yeah. I got some extra time off," and Emma, 9 years old and sharper than most adults gave her credit for, studied his face for a second too long before going back to her math worksheet, filing something away without saying it out loud. Nobody at Meridian ever learned the real reason. David Whitfield, watching from his office as the news moved through the building, felt something settle in his chest that he chose to call relief and not guilt, though it was mostly the second thing. He had needed the leak trace somewhere that wasn't back to him, and Jack Sullivan, quiet, uncomplaining, easy to write off as a man with something to hide, had made himself, without ever meaning to, the perfect place for that trail to end. It would be 8 months before the crack in that story finally started to show, and it would not begin with Jack Sullivan at all. It would begin, of all places, on a stretch of wet highway at 7 in the evening with Natalie Parker's car spinning across 2 lanes of traffic in the rain. If you've ever been the one who took the blame so someone smaller than you didn't have to carry it, you already know exactly what it cost Jack to stay quiet in that room. And we'd love to hear about it if you want to share. The accident made the local news for one cycle and then disappeared. The way these things do, a photo of a crumpled sedan, a line about a CEO in critical but stable condition, a company statement about wishing her a full and speedy recovery, signed by a board that had already, within 48 hours, opened a private conversation about interim leadership. Natalie spent the first 3 days in the ICU mostly unconscious, and when she woke fully on the fourth, the first thing she noticed, before the pain in her wrist, before the stitches along her hairline, was who wasn't there. Her fiancé, Marcus, came once for 11 minutes, checked his phone twice, and left saying he had a work thing, and then didn't come back. He texted twice over the following week, each message shorter than the last, and Natalie understood, with the particular clarity that comes from lying flat on your back, with nothing else to do but think, that whatever they'd had was built on the version of her that never needed anything, and that version was currently in a hospital bed with a cast on her arm. Her board sent flowers, an enormous arrangement, white lilies, a card signed with 6 names in the same handwriting, which told her someone's assistant had signed all 6. David Whitfield sent a text. Thinking of you. Let me know if you need anything handled while you're out. Nothing about coming by. Nothing that wasn't, underneath the concern. A question about who was running things. Nobody came. 9 days, and nobody who had built a life alongside her for the past 18 months walked through that door. And then, on the 9th day, Jack Sullivan did. With his daughter, with soup and a card. Natalie didn't sleep much that first night after they left. She kept the card propped against the water pitcher, on her tray table, the crooked sun catching the light from the hallway every time a nurse opened the door. And she found herself, at 2 in the morning, doing something she hadn't done in longer than she wanted to admit, actually thinking, carefully and without an agenda, about the day she'd fired him. She remembered the 4 seconds she'd looked at that access log. She remembered that she hadn't asked a second question. She remembered, with a discomfort that surprised her, that Jack hadn't defended himself even once, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done any of the things a guilty man protecting himself does, and hadn't done any of the things an innocent man protecting himself does either. He had just said understood and walked out, and at the time she had read that as guilt, and now, lying in a hospital bed with a body that wouldn't move the way she told it to, she found herself reading it as something else entirely. As a man absorbing a hit for someone, she didn't know who yet, but she knew, with the same instinct that had built her career, that something about that afternoon 8 months earlier had never quite added up, and she had simply been too busy to let herself notice. Jack and Emma came back 3 days later, and again the following week. Emma had appointed herself, without asking anyone's permission, as Natalie's unofficial recovery coordinator, arriving with a new drawing every visit, a cat wearing a superhero cape, a garden with flowers and colors that didn't exist in nature, a get well message, spelled with 1 letter reversed, that Natalie found she looked forward to finding more than she looked forward to almost anything else in her week. Jack said little, brought soup or bread, or once a small potted plant he said wouldn't die even if you forgot about it for a while, which made Natalie laugh for the first time in 2 weeks, a real laugh surprised out of her. She asked him once, on the 4th visit, why he kept coming. She hadn't meant to ask it so bluntly, but the painkillers made her filter thinner than usual. Jack considered the question the way he considered everything, with that stillness. You were alone, he said. Nobody should be alone in a place like this. And then, because it was true and he didn't see the point in dressing it up, it's not about the job. There is an old and stubborn belief, in workplaces and outside them, that a man who works with his hands and never climbs the ladder must have less to offer than a man with initials after his name. That competence follows credentials rather than character. Jack Sullivan had spent 9 years quietly proving otherwise on a warehouse floor nobody from the executive suite ever walked, and he was about to prove it again in a hospital room for a woman who had every reason to expect he'd never speak to her again. The real crack, though, the one that would eventually bring the whole thing down, started somewhere Natalie couldn't see. In a NICU 3 miles from the hospital where she lay recovering, where Priya Reyes sat beside an incubator holding her son's tiny hand through the porthole, and finally, after 8 months of silence, told her husband the entire story, start to finish, because she could not carry it alone any longer. Her husband, a quiet man named Marcus Reyes, who worked in IT for a hospital system and had a very particular set of professional habits around documentation, asked her one question that changed everything. "Do you still have the message where David's assistant asked you to pull that folder?" She did. She'd never deleted it. She hadn't known why she'd kept it. Some instinct, some small voice telling her it might matter someday. It mattered now. Back at Meridian, in the vacuum left by Natalie's absence, David Whitfield was not having the recovery he expected either. With the CEO out and the board nervous, he had quietly begun positioning himself as the obvious interim choice, working the room with the retail contract's remaining negotiators, dropping hints in hallway conversations about stability during a difficult transition. But the retail deal, the one that was supposed to be Meridian's crowning achievement, had developed a problem nobody outside 3 people knew about yet. A second leak, smaller, sloppier, this one traceable in a way the first one never should have been. Because David had gotten comfortable, and comfortable men make mistakes that careful men don't. Natalie, still in her hospital bed, still 2 weeks from discharge, had no idea any of this was in motion. She knew only that a man she'd fired 8 months earlier kept showing up with his daughter and asking nothing of her in return, and that the more time she spent with him, the less the story she'd built in her head 8 months ago made any sense at all. She asked him, on what would turn out to be her last week in the hospital, if he would consider coming back, his old job, or something better, whatever it took. She said it carefully, watching his face, half expecting him to say yes immediately and half hoping, though she couldn't have said why, that he wouldn't. Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "No, not unkindly, just certain. I appreciate it. But you fired me over something I wasn't going to explain then, and I'm still not going to explain it now. I don't think you should offer someone their job back, because they brought you soup. That's not a good enough reason for either of us." It would be 2 more months before Natalie found out why he'd really refused, and what he had actually been protecting the whole time. 2 months in which an ordinary Tuesday morning at Meridian's headquarters would blow the entire story open. In a boardroom Jack Sullivan wasn't even in the building to see. Here's a question worth sitting with either way. Was it right for Jack to protect Priya by staying silent for 8 straight months, even at the cost of his own name? Or should he have trusted someone, anyone, with the truth sooner? People land on both sides of that one, and there's no wrong answer, just different instincts about what protecting someone actually looks like. The Tuesday it happened. Natalie was 3 weeks out of the hospital, working half days against her doctor's advice, her cast down to a smaller brace on her wrist, when her assistant put through a call she hadn't been expecting. From Marcus Reyes, a name she didn't immediately place, asking for 15 minutes. He came in with his wife. Priya sat down across from Natalie's desk, looking like a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times and still wasn't ready for it. And she told the whole story in under 10 minutes, start to finish, her voice shaking only once, when she got to the part about Jack finding her crying in the break room and telling her, quietly, that he'd handle it. She had the message, David's assistant's name on it, the timestamp, the folder name, everything. Marcus had already had it forensically preserved. Metadata intact. Nothing that could be dismissed as fabricated after the fact. Natalie read it twice. Then she sat still for almost a full minute, the way Jack sat still when he was thinking, though she'd have been embarrassed to notice the resemblance. He never said a word, she said finally, mostly to herself. He told me not to, Priya said. He said I couldn't afford the fight. He said he could. What happened over the following 6 weeks moved with the particular speed Natalie was known for when she stopped hesitating. She brought in outside counsel, quietly, before David knew anything was happening. She pulled the full access logs from that period, not the selectively presented summary David had handed her 8 months earlier, but the complete record, cross-referenced against building badge swipes, VPN sessions, and the assistant's own device logs, which the assistant, once questioned separately, and given assurance she wasn't the target, handed over without much resistance at all. The picture that emerged was almost embarrassingly clear once someone actually looked for it. David Whitfield had directed the original leak through Priya's account, using his assistant as an intermediary specifically so his own name would never touch the request directly, and had then, when the leak was discovered, handed Natalie a printout that told a true fact. Jack's login existed in the logs, while omitting the fact that David himself had reason to know exactly why, and exactly whose account was really involved. It also turned out that the second leak, the sloppier one during Natalie's hospital stay, was David again, this time growing careless with confidence, trying to smooth over a pricing discrepancy in the retail contract by sharing figures with an industry contact who turned out to be far less discreet than David had assumed. Natalie confronted him on a Thursday afternoon in the same glass-walled office where she'd once told Jack he was terminated. And this time it was David standing while she remained seated, watching the color drain out of a face that had built an entire career on staying composed under pressure. He tried the same soft, regretful register he'd used on her 8 months earlier. "I don't know what you think you've found, Natalie, but I'd be careful about." And it didn't land, not this time, because she had the documents in front of her, and she had spent 3 weeks in a hospital bed, learning the difference between a man who explains himself smoothly and a man who simply tells the truth. David Whitfield was terminated that afternoon and referred to the board's audit committee, and within the month, word of the actual story, quietly at first, then not quietly at all, began moving through the building he'd once run half of. But Natalie didn't wait for the formal process before she went to find Jack. She drove to his house herself, no assistant, no announcement, in the evening, and found him in the driveway checking the air in Emma's bicycle tires, while Emma sat on the front step doing homework in the last of the daylight. He straightened up when he saw her car, wary in a way that made something in Natalie's chest hurt in a way she hadn't expected. "I know what happened," she said, before he could say anything at all. "I know about Priya. I know why you didn't explain yourself. I know you took 8 months of people thinking you were a thief, so a woman with a baby in the NICU didn't lose her income during the worst stretch of her life." Her voice wavered, which almost never happened, and she let it. "I fired a good man because I was too rushed to ask a second question, and you let me believe I was right about it for 8 months, because you were protecting someone who needed protecting more than your own name did. I don't know how to apologize for that in a way that's big enough." Jack set down the bicycle. He didn't say anything for a moment, and Emma, watching from the step, had gone quiet too, sensing this was one of those grown-up moments you weren't supposed to interrupt even if you desperately wanted to. "You don't have to make it big," Jack said finally. "You just have to mean it small." It wasn't forgiveness delivered all at once, the way it sometimes goes in a story that wants a clean turn. It was the start of something slower, an acknowledgement, offered and received, between two people who had both spent a long time being careful not to need anyone. But something had shifted in that driveway, visibly, in the way Jack's shoulders came down half an inch, in the way Natalie didn't get back in her car for another 20 minutes, in the way Emma eventually got up from the step and, without a word, brought Natalie a glass of lemonade like she'd simply decided, on her own authority, that Natalie belonged there now. 6 weeks would pass. 6 weeks of Meridian's board quietly absorbing the truth about David Whitfield. 6 weeks of a company-wide announcement being drafted and redrafted. 6 weeks of Jack still saying no to every version of his old job that Natalie offered him. Before the truth came out publicly, in front of every person who had once watched Jack Sullivan walked out of the building by security. At the all-hands meeting, Natalie called specifically to make sure nobody in that room was ever confused again about who Jack Sullivan actually was. The all-hands meeting was held in the largest space Meridian had, the same warehouse floor Jack had once run, folding chairs set up between the racking. 300 employees crowded in, because word had already gotten around that Natalie was making some kind of announcement and nobody wanted to miss it. Jack hadn't wanted to come. Natalie had asked him anyway, not as an executive summoning an employee, but as herself, standing in his kitchen the night before, saying simply, "I need people to hear it from you being there, not just from me talking about you like you're not in the room." He came. Emma came with him, in a dress she'd chosen herself for the occasion, sitting in the front row swinging her feet because they didn't reach the floor. Natalie stood without notes. She told the room, plainly and without softening any part of it, that 8 months earlier she had fired a man for something he hadn't done, based on evidence that had been deliberately shaped to protect the real person responsible, and that the man she'd fired had known the truth the entire time and said nothing, because saying something would have cost a young mother with a newborn in intensive care the paycheck she needed to survive the worst months of her life. She named David Whitfield. She named what he'd done, plainly, the way she should have investigated it the first time. And then she looked directly at Jack, sitting in the front row with his daughter beside him, and said that the company owed him not just his job back, but an apology that no title change could fully cover, and that she intended to spend a long time making sure Meridian became the kind of place where a man wouldn't have to choose between his own name and someone else's survival ever again. The applause that followed wasn't polite applause. It went on long enough that Jack looked, for the first time in the entire meeting, genuinely uncomfortable, and Emma reached over and took his hand, and he held on to it like it was the thing keeping him upright. Natalie offered him, formally, a senior operations directorship, an office, a title, a seat at the leadership table, more money than he'd made in his life. Jack thanked her, in front of everyone, and then declined it, in front of everyone too, which made David's old allies in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats, and made everyone else lean forward. "I don't want an office," he said. "I want the floor. I want a policy. Real, written down, not a poster in the break room, that says nobody at this company ever has to choose between telling the truth and keeping their kids' insurance. Put my name on that instead of a door." Natalie built it. The Sullivan Protocol, employees started calling it within a year, an internal whistleblower and hardship protection framework that guaranteed continued pay and benefits during any internal investigation for any employee who came forward with information in good faith, regardless of what that information cost them personally. Priya Reyes helped write the parental leave provisions herself, sitting in a conference room with a healthy toddler on her lap 18 months later, a very different room than the one where she'd once confessed everything, with her voice shaking. Jack went back to running the warehouse floor, exactly the job he'd asked for, and somehow, without either of them ever quite deciding it out loud, Natalie started finding reasons to walk that floor herself more often than any CEO before her ever had. Months later, quiet ones, unremarkable in the way real recovery usually is. There was an evening in early autumn when Natalie sat on Jack's back porch while Emma chased fireflies across the yard in the dark, and the crooked construction paper sun from that first hospital visit was framed, of all places, on the wall just inside the kitchen door, because Natalie had asked if she could keep it, and Jack had said it wasn't his to give away. It was Emma's, and Emma had said Natalie could have it as long as she visited enough to earn it. She had. She did, every week, sometimes twice. "You could have told me the truth that first day," Natalie said, watching Emma's shape move through the dark yard, in my office, before any of it happened. "I could have," Jack agreed, "but you weren't ready to hear it that way. You needed to see it instead." He looked at her, and there wasn't any bitterness left in it, hadn't been for a long time. Some people have to be shown who somebody really is. Telling them doesn't work. Emma came running up onto the porch with cupped hands, a single firefly glowing faintly between her fingers, and held it out to Natalie like an offering. And Natalie cupped her own hands around it and watched it blink once, twice, before Emma let it go back into the dark. Here's the thing about people like Jack Sullivan. The world is full of them, quiet men and women who show up early, stay late, and never once ask anyone to notice. The ones who absorb the hit so someone smaller doesn't have to, and who are so easy to underestimate precisely because they never ask you not to. It wasn't a title that made him worth trusting. It was 9 years of showing up, and one act of quiet protection that cost him everything, and the fact that, even after all of that, he still walked into a hospital room with soup and a card, because he believed no one should be alone in a place like that. Has someone in your own life ever been the one who quietly took the blame, or the one nobody bothered to check on? Someone written off before anyone took the time to really see them? Tell us who they were in the comments. Even if all you can do now is finally give them the credit you should have given them then. And if you believe the quiet, overlooked people in your own life deserve to be seen the way Jack finally was, we'd be glad to have you stick around for more stories like his. Because sometimes the person nobody thought to invite into the room turns out to be the only one who was ever really there.